I need you to stay with me on this one, because what I watched didn't feel like politics. It felt like a system testing how far it can go. Today I watched a congressional hearing with one job: put a spotlight on what happens when the justice system starts drifting away from the rule of law and towards something that looks a lot more like loyalty enforcement. And I'm going to walk you through it carefully, piece by piece, because the details matter more than the headline. Now, before anybody jumps in with tribal reflexes, this isn't about whether you like or hate a politician. This is about whether a justice system can survive when it starts behaving like an enforcement arm for whoever holds power. Controlled quiet. Step by step. Because the pattern is the story. But here's what hit me. Underneath the political packaging, the allegations being described are not small. They're not mean tweets. They're claims that the independence of the justice system is being bent, not with one dramatic order, but with pressure, intimidation, and selective enforcement. And the reason this matters, even if you don't trust Congress, even if you don't trust the DOJ, even if you think the whole place is rotten, is because the moment law becomes a weapon of loyalty, you don't get justice. You get permission slips for the powerful and consequences for the disposable. So here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to break the hearing into a handful of moves the administration is accused of making. Moves that, when you stack them together, create a single message. And I want you to listen for that message, because by the end, you're going to hear it clearly. The hearing opens with a theme: weaponization of the Justice Department, not in the lazy cable news way where everything is a talking point, but in a structural way. They talk about leadership being filled with personal lawyers and loyalists, and about the justice system being pushed to protect allies and punish opponents. And again, don't get stuck on partisan framing. Focus on the mechanism. When the justice system stops acting like a neutral referee, it becomes a lever to reward, a lever to threaten, a lever to make people fall in line without ever issuing a formal decree. And what you hear repeatedly is not one scandal. It's a pattern. Not one incident. Not two. A pattern. And the hearing positions itself as an attempt to document that pattern in public, because the argument is basically, if you don't drag it into the light, it keeps spreading in the dark. Now hold on to that, because once we move into the next section, the tactics get more direct. This is where the story shifts from high-level claims to something that feels personal. The hearing discusses targeting law firms and attorneys, not because they committed a crime, but because they represented people or causes that were disfavored. Let me say that slower. The concept being described as punishment for legal representation. And that's one of those lines, one of those red lines, that a country either respects or it doesn't. Because if a lawyer can be punished for taking a case, then rights exist only for people who are politically safe. The hearing raises the issue of executive orders and actions aimed at restricting or punishing firms, including consequences tied to government contracts, federal access and security clearances, tools that can cripple a firm without ever charging them with anything. And here's the part that matters for viewers like you: skeptical, anti-establishment, suspicious of the entire machine. This isn't about a law firm's feelings. This is about a warning system. Because law firms aren't just businesses, they're infrastructure. They're the people you need when you're up against the state. So when pressure is applied to them, it doesn't just hit them. It hits anyone who might need them next. And the hearing brings in witnesses, people from within the legal world, describing the chilling effect, the threats, the atmosphere. Still controlled. Still procedural. But the tension is building. Because once you start asking, so what happens to the people inside the DOJ? That's where you get to the next chapter. The hearing describes attacks on public servants, especially career employees, people who aren't supposed to be political, people whose job is supposed to survive administrations. They describe firings, demotions, reassignments, pressure applied to the parts of the system that actually make cases function. And look, if you've been alive long enough, you already know Washington is full of internal games. But the allegation here is something different. It's that pressure is being applied not just to outcomes, but to the people who could resist the outcomes. And if you understand institutional capture, even if you hate the institution, you understand the strategy. You don't need to change the law if you control who enforces it. You don't need to win arguments if you can control who gets punished for making them. Which brings us to the policies and actions the hearing highlights. This is where the hearing tries to add weight, specific examples, specific moves. They discuss executive orders targeting law firms in ways that can limit access and clearances, a described withdrawal/dismissal of corruption prosecution involving New York City Mayor Eric Adams, framed as political alignment. Source: claims about restoring gun rights to a supporter, mentioning Mel Gibson. A broader alleged purge of career employees inside DOJ and law enforcement components. Claims of gutting oversight, including references to Inspector General and the Office of Public Integrity, and suspending enforcement tied to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, you don't have to accept every allegation at face value, but here's what you should notice. Every one of these items, whether you agree with the politics or not, has the same direction. It's power-reducing resistance, power-reducing oversight, power-raising the cost of dissent. And when the cost of dissent goes up high enough, most people don't need to be forced. They comply voluntarily. Which is why, throughout this hearing, the phrase you can almost hear underneath the words is, "Don't make yourself a problem." Now, pause here. Because at this point in the story, if you're like me, you might be thinking, okay, this is heated rhetoric. It's oversight theater. It's partisan. Maybe. But the reason I'm talking about this today is because the hearing contains one piece, one episode, where the alleged behavior stops being abstract. It becomes physical. It becomes personal. And I'm saving it for the end because it reframes everything that comes before it. So stay with me. Let me explain. The difference between normal corruption and what's being described here. Normal corruption is backroom deals favors quiet pressure plausible deniability. What's being described in this hearing is something colder. A system where you don't just reward allies. You actively discipline people who threaten the narrative. And the legal world is uniquely vulnerable to that because lawyers and DOJ staff operate on credentials, access, clearances, reputations. You don't have to arrest them. You just have to put a shadow over their name. You just have to make the phone ring at midnight. You just have to make an example out of one person. And everyone else will do your job for you. That's not justice. That's a message campaign. And the hearing repeatedly frames itself as a warning about a constitutional crisis, with comparisons to historical moments where institutions bent slowly, then all at once. Again, whether you buy the comparison or not, the rhetorical purpose is clear. They're trying to say, this is the slope. This is the early stage. This is where people still have a chance to resist. Which brings me to the final act. And this is where the cold control starts cracking. Not into chaos, into something sharper. All right, here's the moment that made me stop and replay the timeline. One of the witnesses discussed is Liz Oyer, a former pardon attorney. And in this hearing, she describes something that, if accurate, should chill anyone who believes testimony is supposed to be free from intimidation. She recounts that 2 armed Special Deputy U.S. Marshals were directed to be sent to her home late at night to deliver a letter warning her about the risks of testifying. The framing presented is that this was done in a way that would discourage her from testifying. Let me keep my voice steady here. Because this is where people start screaming dictatorship, and other people start screaming fake news, and everyone retreats into their trench. So I want you to think about this like an investigator, not a partisan. If someone wants to warn a witness about risks, there are 1,000 ways to do that. Email, phone call, counsel-to-counsel communication, formal notice through attorneys, even a standard delivery during normal hours. But armed marshals, late at night, at the home. That's not a neutral delivery method. That's theater. And the only purpose of that kind of theater is psychological. It says, we know where you live. We can show up. We can escalate whenever we want, even if nobody says those words out loud. And here's why that matters. Because intimidation doesn't need to be explicit to be effective. It just needs to be felt. The hearing also describes broader ongoing efforts to intimidate witnesses from speaking and references that threats against the legal community are real and consequential. So now, go back to the earlier sections. Law firms targeted, clearances threatened, contracts stripped, oversight gutted, career people pressured. Do you see what the Marshals episode does? It doesn't stand alone. It completes the pattern. Because once you accept that the system will show up at your home, armed over testimony, then everything else makes sense. The executive orders make sense. The loyalty tests make sense. The quiet reassignments make sense. The reputational attacks make sense. Because it's all part of one machine. Enforcement through fear and consequence. And now at this point, I'm going to name the person the hearing names because this is where the escalation earns its impact. The hearing is explicitly framed as exposing Trump's attacks on the rule of law. Not politics, not vibes, not narratives. Attacks on the idea that the justice system exists above personal loyalty. And you can argue with their conclusions. You can argue with their motives. But you cannot pretend this hearing is about nothing. Because testimony like that about marshals at a home forces a question that nobody wants to answer. Who ordered it? Who approved it? And what, exactly, was the message supposed to be? So here's where I'm left, still processing it. Not with a neat bow, not with a case closed. With three questions that feel louder than everything else. 1. Who made the call to send armed marshals to a witness's home late at night over testimony? Source. 2. If that's what happens when cameras are on and oversight is happening, what do you think happens when oversight disappears? 3. How many people inside the system, lawyers, staff, investigators, saw that kind of pressure up close and decided, it's not worth it? Because that's how the slide happens. Not through one big dramatic moment, through 1,000 quiet decisions, made by people who don't want trouble. And the final question, the one I can't let go of, is this. If the justice system becomes a loyalty instrument, what happens to everyone who isn't protected by loyalty? I'm going to keep pulling on this. Because the pattern is the point. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.